Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be discussing my review of the film BrainStorm. So just a bit about the film. BrainStorm is a documentary that follows 6 people living with bipolar disorder and explores their experiences living with this illness. It also delves into the science of bipolar disorder and some of the treatments for it. So to start, I want to begin with some of the things I thought the film did well, and I have some notes here, so if I'm looking down and reading from it, that's why. So starting with the things I thought the film did really well. I thought the film did a great job highlighting the diverse experiences of bipolar disorder. I found the stories of the people living with bipolar disorder very relatable. The experiences of depression, the way it just shuts you down, and the way mania just makes you feel like you're on top of the world, and the way that you're super productive and just full of energy and acting in ways that you are not always in control of, really relatable. There was a quote where someone said, "I didn't know who I was without my brain." And that really spoke to me because I remember when I started to have bipolar symptoms, I didn't know how to understand myself anymore because I was acting out in ways that I never would have normally acted in. I just felt like I didn't know who I was, and my brain was something that I relied upon so much. And so now that it was behaving in ways that I couldn't control, it was a real blow to my sense of self and identity. I like that the film had representation of people of all walks of life living with bipolar disorder. There was the inclusion of a young boy who had this illness and also a mother living with bipolar disorder. The stories of young people, of mothers, are often overlooked in mainstream media, so I'm glad that this film included them. I also appreciated the scientific portions of this film. I thought it was really interesting to learn about the science behind bipolar disorder, things like epigenetics, in which the environment influences which genes are expressed. I'm also glad that this film discussed bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. I think oftentimes bipolar 2 disorder can be overlooked and labeled as the less severe form of bipolar disorder when that's not necessarily the case. So I'm glad that this film discussed how truly life-disrupting bipolar 2 disorder can be, and I'm glad that they discussed bipolar disorder as a spectrum. So people can fall anywhere along the spectrum of bipolarity, and so the symptom presentation of bipolar disorder can look very different in different people, but they still exist along the bipolar spectrum. There was also a lot of emphasis on the film about misdiagnosis and how long it takes to get a bipolar diagnosis. And for many participants in the film, it took years, if not decades, to get the right diagnosis. And the film strongly emphasized how difficult that makes life not getting the right diagnosis in a timely fashion, and how much suffering there is when you are struggling with an undiagnosed bipolar disorder. The film discussed how 1 in 3 teens diagnosed with depression actually have bipolar disorder, which I didn't know. Early intervention and the right diagnosis were major themes in this film, and the film talked about the lack of screening for bipolar disorder in the healthcare system and how important it is that we have better screening for this illness so that people aren't falling through the cracks, getting misdiagnosed, and spending years of their lives suffering with this illness. There was also a portion of the film that discussed treatments for bipolar disorder, things like ketamine, TMS, keto, light therapy, social rhythm therapy, medications, and just healthy habits like sleep and exercise. I thought this was really great. I really like that they included a lot of lifestyle interventions because medication isn't the only way to treat bipolar disorder, although it is also an important tool. They just also discussed the struggle of finding the right medication, which is something that I have been through so many times. It's incredibly difficult, the trial and error, how many medications you have to try until you find something that works for you. And so the film really explored people's experiences with this trial and error process of trying to find the right medications and how frustrating and difficult that is. I thought there was also a very important discussion on stigma and the ways in which bipolar disorder is represented in the media, and how that is not an accurate reflection of the people living with this condition. Often those representations are very negative, violent, dangerous, and that just creates more stigma surrounding this illness. And finally, I really appreciated that this film gave a lot of hope for recovery. All the people in this film had amazing stories of living with bipolar disorder, suffering immensely, but then finding a way out of their suffering and living a whole and complete and meaningful life, which I thought was incredibly powerful and very needed. The people interviewed appeared to be living very full and meaningful lives, even with bipolar disorder. But with that said, they didn't all have uniform understandings or experiences with their illness. Some of the participants said that they wouldn't wish away their bipolar disorder because it made them who they were. And another participant said, given the chance, she would, of course, in a heartbeat, get rid of this disorder. So I'm glad they had that diversity in experiences. I think it was really powerful to see how different people related to their illness. So those are the things I thought the film did really well. Now I'm going to get into my critiques of the film. Firstly, I felt like the film severely lacked critical analysis, which was really disappointing for me. Even though they discussed at length the suffering caused by misdiagnosis, there was no discussion about the barriers to accessing care. And this was really shocking to me because not only are people misdiagnosed, but they don't even have the resources to access the care to get a diagnosis in the first place. There was no discussion on the systematic barriers and exclusions that prevent people from accessing care. For a film set in the US, there was only one line where someone mentioned having difficulties with insurance. Otherwise, there was no discussion on how poverty, racism, ableism, and all other forms of discrimination prevent people from accessing the life-saving mental health care that they need. I felt like it should have been a huge portion of the film talking about how access to mental health care isn't uniform for everyone. There are lots of systemic oppressions that prevent people from being able to access good care and receive treatment. In the US, of course, cost is a huge barrier, but also in Canada, where our healthcare is free, it's becoming more and more privatized and wait times are incredibly long. The film did mention that there are not enough psychiatrists, but it didn't talk about the healthcare system and how people can't afford to get psychiatric treatment in the first place. It would have benefited from some critical analysis of the way that our healthcare system is for profit and not for people. And that brings me on to my second critique, which is that there was no analysis of systems of injustice or systemic oppression in this film, which is shocking for a film about mental health. It was really surprising to me that social determinants of health were not mentioned at all during the film. I don't think these are superfluous to a film about mental health. I think they're integral and crucial to any discussion of mental illness and recovery. Although there were people of color in this film, it lacked true representation and diversity because it didn't situate any of their experiences in systems of oppression. For example, racism wasn't mentioned, neither was poverty, and barely was trauma. These are critical to any discussions of mental illness. Even though they emphasized misdiagnosis, they did not talk about the racial disparities when it comes to misdiagnosis. For example, I did some research and I found this article that says, published data shows that bipolar persons of African ancestry compared with bipolar persons of non-African ancestry are more often misdiagnosed with a disease other than bipolar disorder, i.e. schizophrenia. So even when talking about misdiagnosis, that doesn't exist in a vacuum. Misdiagnosis happens more frequently to Black people, and this was never discussed in the film at all. Even during the science portion of the film, it would have benefited from some critical analysis. In the same article, they discuss how genome-wide association studies are mostly done on people of European ancestry. Black and other minority populations are underrepresented in genetic studies. So even in a film that is focused on the science of bipolar disorder, you have to still talk about race and class and other systemic injustices. They never discussed how poverty is a major contributor to causing mental illness and also exacerbates mental illness and can be a consequence of mental illness. Even when they discussed treatment options for bipolar disorder, there was no discussion of the social determinants of health. They never mentioned that access to healthcare, access to healthy food, stable housing, safety, security, education, social supports, and physical environments are all incredibly crucial to good mental health and recovery. Yes, lifestyle interventions are incredibly important, but we have to discuss the systemic barriers to even implementing them in the first place. When it comes to treatment for mental illness with medication, I found an article that discusses In 2014, Dr. McMaster helped conduct a study about treatment in Black and white Americans with bipolar disorder. They found that 17% of white people with bipolar disorder had received a mood stabilizer in the past year. None of the Black people had received mood stabilizers. In 2017, a study by Dr. McMaster and colleagues compared treatments in Hispanic and non-Hispanic white people with bipolar disorder. They found that 21% of non-Hispanic white people were taking mood stabilizers. None of the Hispanic people were taking them. So even when it comes to medication treatment, Black and Hispanic people are not getting any care. They're not getting any mood stabilizers. And this is not something that was discussed in the film at all. There was one story in the film of a young Black boy who was so frequently disciplined and suspended from school due to his mental illness that his mom ended up homeschooling him. The film did discuss that schools don't have the adequate resources to offer care and instead deal with mental illness through punitive measures. But they never mentioned anti-Blackness as a contributing factor to this boy's experiences, which was really surprising to me because we know Black children are disproportionately face punitive measures compared to non-Black children, and they don't receive the mental health care that they need. Rather, they are expelled and suspended very frequently. When we're talking about these stories of people of color, but we're not contextualizing them in systems of oppression, then we just have all these individual stories that exist in a vacuum, that are divorced from intersectionality and lived experiences of racism and poverty and trauma and all the other forms of oppression and discrimination. I will give the film credit that they did talk about how schools are now having security officers placed in them rather than having mental health care and mental health training. I wish the film had delved more into topics like this because they are so important to talk about. The way racialized youth, Black children, are so frequently criminalized for mental illness. But instead, the stories of bipolar disorder were just presented as if they exist in a vacuum, as if an individual's only experience with this illness is depression and mania. My final critique of the film is the inclusion of the story of a U.S. general in this film's narrative. The film featured stories from a bunch of different people with bipolar disorder, and one of them was a general in the Iraq War. The film heavily supports and propagandizes the U.S. military, which is utterly shameful, if I'm being frank. The U.S. military is the most violent and destructive force on the planet. They have conducted countless coups, destabilizing numerous countries. They have killed and displaced millions of people. They've invaded countries for no reason whatsoever. And this general was a general in the Iraq War, meaning he invaded Iraq under the complete fabrication that they had weapons of mass destruction. He killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis for no reason whatsoever, displaced millions of people, and we're expected to empathize with his mental health after committing these horrors. That was just really off-putting for me. What about the mental health of the Iraqis whose lives you've ruined, whose homes you've destroyed, whose children you've made orphans? Do they not count? Does their mental health not matter? It was truly horrific to see the U.S. military glorified to the point where the general says, "We conquered Iraq." You're expected to have sympathy for this man in the U.S. military because of his experiences with bipolar disorder, but never once are the victims of U.S. imperialism and U.S. violence ever mentioned. So what are my final thoughts? If you want a film that just explores what is bipolar disorder, what does it look like, who does it affect, and what is the science behind it, then this film does that really well. But if you're looking for something of substance, of depth, that examines systems of oppression, that interrogates trauma and also barriers to accessing mental health care, that looks at poverty and racism, then this film is deeply, deeply lacking. I also found the whole military portion incredibly off-putting, like I said, and for that reason alone, I felt like the film did not represent me as a racialized person, as a Muslim living with bipolar disorder. Like I mentioned, although there were people of color featured in this film, I did not feel like it represented people of color because there was no mention of how our lived experiences shape how we experience mental illness and how we are treated for our mental illness and how we receive or do not receive care. Of course, as a Muslim, the fact that the Iraq War was so heavily glorified, as if that wasn't the start on the global war on terror that has ruined the lives of Muslims all across the world, that was really difficult to watch. I think what I really disliked about this film is that it was stuck on the individual level. By not mentioning systems of oppression, by not mentioning social determinants of health, by ignoring Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality, it left it hollow and exclusionary. I really think that we deserve better bipolar representation than what this film offered. I believe that we deserve a more critical lens and interrogation of systems of oppression. If you're looking for stories of mental illness that offers more depth and that is more compelling, I would really recommend the book Strangers to Ourselves by Rachel Aviv. I recommended it in another video and I'll recommend it again. It also features stories of different individuals living with mental illness, not specifically bipolar disorder, but a range of mental illnesses. And it is incredibly complex, interrogates systems of oppression, talks about barriers to access. It's extremely nuanced and very, very well written. I will just mention, trigger warning though, there is a death by an eating disorder and an infant's death if that's going to be triggering to you. So that's my review of BrainStorm the film. Thank you so much, Mohamed, for suggesting I make this video. If you saw the film, I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments. I still would recommend watching it. I think it's worthwhile to take a look. So if you do end up watching it, definitely let me know what you thought. Thank you for watching my video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.